All right, we are live. And I'm going to just double check here, make sure this is working out. Yes. Okay. Looks like we're good to go. So we've got a few viewers here. Thanks for joining us. I am Eric Ragland. I am the owner of Curse Morsels Press. We are here today with Julia Rios and Nadia Bulkin, the editors of Why Didn't You Just Leave, a volume of wonderful, amazing, scary, frightening, gorgeous, incredible ghost stories. And it looks like we have one of our authors here in the comments with us too, Alexis Devon. Hi, Alexis.
Ooh.
So, yeah. So I think we'll kind of jump right on in. We're going to do a couple opening questions, and then we are going to hear from the editors about kind of their thoughts on each story. As an opener, what first drew you both to ghost stories, and what's the first ghost story, true or fictional, that you remember responding to strongly? Julia, you want to start?
Sure. So I can't remember a time when I didn't love ghost stories. Like I've literally loved them for my entire life. When I was a kid, I thought about this, and the two things that really stand out to me are the scary stories to tell in the dark books, and then also the ghost story that was the most exciting to me as a kid was Wait Till Helen Comes by Mary Downing Hahn, which has like a girl and her family, including her younger stepsister, move out to a scary house in the country. And then a young ghost girl tries to lure the stepsister into a lake to drown. And it's very scary.
How about you, Nadia?
I mean, I always say that I got into ghost stories because Indonesia is obsessed with ghost stories, and that's where I grew up. I also think that ghost stories just are a great way to navigate loss and grief and like very, very human, experiences. But that's sort of something I came to later. My first exposure was definitely like the very sort of social engineering type ghost stories that you got in Indonesia about like don't look behind you if you hear your name being called at night, like those sort of warnings, that everyone just kind of seems to know and won't really acknowledge like, well, what's the logic behind that? And they won't really tell you. So but you just know not to do it. So that was kind of my first exposure.
Awesome. We'll do one more question before we get into the individual stories, but thinking about how there are so many different types of ghost stories, as readers, writers, storytellers, and editors, how have your tastes in ghost stories changed over time? And part of the reason I ask this is because, you are the editors of this book. We're curious about your tastes and sort of wonder, how have those shifted over time? What do they look like now? Nadia, do you want to start this one?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, I think my taste in ghost stories became much more sort of meta. Like I've become much more interested in like what does the ghost sort of represent, and how does a person's interaction with the ghost change based on their own psychological sort of mindset coming into the ghost experience, for example. So I think it's changed in that way, and I think it's also changed in the sense of like J-horror has opened my mind towards like ghost as apocalypse, like Cairo and Ju-on to a lesser extent, as kind of like a social vehicle for like critique, which I think is really, really interesting. So it's kind of deviated away from just like a pure social warning thing to like, what does this social warning say about us? In the way that I think a lot of people's tastes in horror tend to evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I agree with that assessment a lot. I think that as a kid, I was just thrilled by the idea of being scared. I think that's at the heart of a lot of horror fans' first love. But then I also, even from a very young age, was very afraid of like death and what comes next. And like Nadia, grew up with cultural norms about that. My father was from Mexico, and his family had all kinds of superstitions about various things that you do or don't do. But as I grew older and started to assimilate more things into my psyche, I also started to care more about why we want ghosts. Why are they so attractive to us? And what do they represent? And now when I'm reading a ghost story, I still like that like frisson of scariness, but I also really am drawn to stories that tell us more about ourselves and how we're interacting with the world.
Awesome. Thank you both. So we are going to get right into the stories. I am actually going to disappear into the background. I'm going to go ahead and mute my camera, but I'm going to monitor the chat. So viewers, if you have any comments, any questions you'd like to share, please go ahead and do that. We might have time for questions at the end, depending on kind of where we are, how we're feeling. But in the meantime, let's jump in. I think we're going to talk about Corey Fahrenkopf's story first. So I will go ahead and mute myself, and y'all can go for it.
Yeah, so I'll kick off this story, and this story is oh my gosh, can people read that? Okay, yeah, kind of, yeah. So no joy exists anywhere beyond your front door, and this was a really exciting submission that we received. I mean, talking about meta ghost stories, this is like the most meta of the meta, in my opinion, and in a very delightful way. And it kind of serves as our tentpole story that links the entire anthology together, because it really touches on a lot of the themes that we ended up really focused on, about like, what are you looking for in a living space? How can you sort of negotiate with the dangers that might exist in that space? So it's kind of a choose your own adventure format that luckily Corey was like game with us trying to experiment a little bit. So the story weaves in and out of the book. And yeah, I think people have been super, super jazzed about it. So yeah, I'm really excited about this one.
Yeah, I agree. That had such an exciting format, and I remember just both of us being like, "Can we split this up? Can we take it and will Corey let us just like chop it up and put it in different places?" And then when we were coming up with the order of the book as a whole, we realized that it was just perfectly made to go at the sort of the head of various themed sections. So that's kind of what we did with it, and I think it's a really lovely story. It's fun, it's clever, it's also scary, and it touches on so many different themes, and I love that.
Cool. Onward, Julia.
Oh, right. Yeah. So it's my turn. I'm like, okay, Nadia, go ahead. Forgetting that we agreed ahead of time that I was going to talk next. So I'm talking next about the second story in the anthology, which is called The World Ended There by Alberto Chimal, who is a Mexican author. He's a very popular horror author in Mexico. Most people in the US haven't really heard of him, but he does have some books out in English, so you can actually find some of his work. And this story just ripped my heart out. It's so profoundly sad. It's about a family that moves from a city to a smaller place, like a couple hours away, so that they can buy a house. But then the cost of that is that the area that they live in, people kidnap and murder girls a lot, and the daughter ends up being murdered, and it's about how the family deals with that. And the saddest thing about this is that it is really very based in true things that actually happen in Mexico. So it's a beautiful story and also really rough.
Yeah, it's quite devastating. And I think in some ways sort of a traditional also ghost story that I think has been sort of passed down in various ways through in like various cultures where you deal with like this sacrifice of danger, survival, safety, in very, very like visceral ways. I think fans of Lake Mungo, the movie, will really love this one because that's kind of in a way what's happening here, and the negotiation of like, do you stay essentially in a grave?
Yeah, like if something horrible has happened, do you stay because you have an attachment to what came before?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, next up is Exposure by E.M. Linden, which I know is one of Julia's pet favorites. But it is also one of my favorites. Obviously, I love them all. But Exposure is by an author from New Zealand. And it is unique in the anthology in the sense that it takes place in a remote outpost somewhere in the wilderness in the mountains. And the why didn't you just leave equation here is unique because literally there may or may not be a blizzard raging outside. And the calculus is complex, to say the least. Basically, you're stranded in a cabin in an outpost. It's like a hunting cabin or something like that.
No, it's a hiking cabin. This is an actual thing in New Zealand. So, like in New Zealand, hikers can stop at cabins just for free and stay, and they have like little sign-in books, and you just say like, "I stayed here this night," and then you move on the next day.
Yeah, but imagine you're stranded there, and you think there's someone else stranded with you. Maybe, but they don't seem to be moving.
They don't seem to be moving, but they do seem to be staring at you. And also there's a plaque on the wall commemorating someone who died in that same area because of a blizzard.
This one also comes with a wonderful illustration.
Yes.
It's beautiful and wonderful. It is one of two illustrations by Eve Tourigny.
Yes. And it's so good. This story, I just was so excited about this story because the setting is so unique and very thoroughly like part of this hiking culture, which is not what I was expecting when we set out to get this book of haunted house stories. And it's also, to me, it feels like a very classically creepy ghost out to get you story.
Totally. Yeah.
Okay, so next we have Spend a Penny. Oh my gosh, we both love this one too. The thing is, we both love every story, so we're just going to be like, we love this one.
Yeah.
Spend a Penny by Di Booth. This story is the first story in the anthology that is set in a workplace. Somebody works in a cinema and has a deep fear of the bathrooms there. And every time she has to go in and clean them, she's like creeped out by it. There's not much that really exactly happens, but it's so full of atmosphere and it's so like, ugh.
Yeah, it is so, you get right into the story. And the whole thing about like the spend a penny, like I can't think about that phrase now without getting creeped out.
I mean, the phrase public bathroom now.
Prior to this story, but now it's like, it gives me the same vibes as like the Insidious movies where it's like tiptoe through the window. It's like that. I feel like that's what Spend a Penny is, and yeah, it is really, really, really creepy.
Yeah, I also love this. Is also the first of a couple of different stories in this anthology that have a trans protagonist, and that's not really the focus of this story. It's more incidental, but it's still like factors into her feelings about bathrooms because that's an experience that trans people have to worry about.
Yeah, so we have a few others that also sort of touch on similar themes later on. Okay, next is Kin. This is our second translated story. And Julia just did an incredible job translating both of these stories. Kin is by Raquel Castro, and I think it's another generational trauma story similar to The World Ended There, but it is of a much longer view of generations. Like World Ended There is very sort of immediate, personal, your daughter. And Kin is like when you are left looking multiple generations back and trying to make a better future. And I think the question mark is here with this haunted house and all the tragedies that have happened in this haunted house. Is that even possible to craft a better future? So yeah, it's a very interesting story with multiple layers and some really scary imagery as well. But it's really kind of like a really like long-term view kind of ghost story, which is really cool.
Yeah.
I think that's how ghosts actually work.
I think for me, one of the things that I find so exciting about this one is sort of the shadow of colonialism and how it sort of like reaches its tentacles into everything. And everything that happens in this cursed house is basically down to some people a few centuries ago trying to be greedy about colonialist intentions, and then everybody else that tries to continue it in whatever way. It's like no matter if you're trying to do something good, you're still working with rotten fruit.
Yeah, it's a great way of putting it.
So anyway, yes, I did enjoy translating both of these stories. Helps when the writing is just fantastic. The next story we have, I know this one is also one of Nadia's pet favorites. I love it too. But I feel like Nadia, you have a very specific reason for appreciating it. It's your
Yes.
application to vacate 372 Wicker Avenue is still pending by Steve Loyaconi. And that one, I think it's one of the more humorous stories that we have. It's about a family that is trying to leave a haunted house after they bought the haunted house for cheap from a government program because it was haunted. But then it turns out to be more than they bargained for. And of course, bad things happen to them. And it's all told through the letters that are sort of like going back and forth between the family and the government agency. But again, it's kind of humorous, but also if you think about what's happening, it's like, oh, that's very bad.
Yeah, it's like the dark humor of bureaucratic nightmares, which I think almost everybody, at least in the United States and probably the world around, can relate to. When you're, it's very much like a Catch-22-esque story. Like, well, I can't fly because I'm crazy. Well, but that's what a sane person would say. They wouldn't want to risk their life flying, so you're not crazy. It's that kind of bureaucratic nightmare. And the reason that Julia hinted that I love this so much is because so Steve and I are both based in the DMV. I don't actually know Steve personally, but when I read it, I was like, I've read so many stories that try to mimic the like absurdities of Washington, D.C. federal government like life and that ecosystem. And when I read this, I was like, oh, this guy is like actually like local. Like he gets it. I can tell he gets it. And then we like checked the address and it was like, oh yeah, he's and so like I also
doesn't know, the DMV is DC, Maryland, Virginia, and it's the area right around Washington, DC, which I just thought I should say because I might not have known that earlier, but now I do.
That's true. When I first, it's not the Department of Motor Vehicles.
Yeah.
Although the fact that it is the same like acronym is like kind of appropriate in a hilarious way. So anyway, yes, I like the realism here is spooky for non-paranormal reasons.
So then the next one, it's your turn again, and we have one more section of Corey's story, and then we go into the J.W. McCarthy, which I know you want to talk about.
Yes. So Lamai by J.W. McCarthy is another illustrated story, and it is also a story that is close to my heart because it deals with a family that is in a diaspora and is dealing with cultural traditions bleeding in. There's like a white half and a Thai half of the family. And the Thai half of the family has brought certain traditions in, such as the spirit house, the Thai spirit house. But there's also some other things that come with a spirit house. And this is, I think, I would say like, above all else, a story about longing and desire for things that even may not be good for you, but maybe they are, depending on what. Yeah, it's yeah. I feel like I'm not summarizing this very well, but hopefully I'm intriguing you with Thai Spirit House and things coming out of walls, which, as we all know, is one of the most frightening things that can happen in a story. Is for
Only
something.
good things can happen when something comes out of the
I
wall.
don't know. I feel like a limb comes out of a wall, and
it's here to help.
Yeah. I mean, how can it help you today? How can it help you today?
I think also for this one, I love that it's also a queer story and it's another generational story. So there's sort of an examination of the ways that people deal with queer identity across generations and the ways that repression can harm you, but also the ways that even when things are more permissive, you can still get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, it's like the sort of like double-edged sword of like liberation and boundlessness. Like, yeah, you're free, but you're vulnerable. Like, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
your freedom doesn't necessarily ensure good choices.
Yes.
I see Alexis says, I'm a fan of the wall limb.
I mean, maybe you should get some wall limbs for your home, your beautiful home that we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Oh no. Oh no. Okay, so next after that one is The Spirit Bed by Eden Royce. And I have been a fan of Eden Royce for years. I love her writing. She does a lot of like Southern Gothic stuff. This story is about sisters and it's about difficult family dynamics and it's about what happens when you buy a cursed bed and then it tries to eat you. And you get to see what happens when sisters try to save each other, question mark.
Yeah, this is one of those like super like, I don't know, insidious stories that you think you know what's happening and who the characters are when it starts. And you know sort of like what the stakes are, what's going on, and you're sort of like, oh, okay, this is how it's going to go. It doesn't go that way because the characters are much, much deeper than you initially thought. And yeah, it's one of a few stories in this anthology that I think Julie and I both like are super attached to that are like full of really tricksy twists.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is like it's a subtle twist and that you kind of see, you see it developing, but it's one of those like, well, you are making your bed and you are lying in it, but it's not
quite literally.
But it's not the person that you initially think is perhaps making those choices.
Yeah. It's also a very messed up family dynamic story, and I feel like we have a few of those, and I think all of them are amazing.
Yeah, I think that was like kind of the theme that ended up running through Why Didn't You Just Leave? Which I think says something about the answer to that question what the answer would be for a lot of us.
Yeah, something to do with not being able to leave your family, even though the situation is not healthy.
Yep, 100%.
So.
Oh, my turn. Right? My turn?
Your turn.
My turn. Okay, yay. Okay, so I am now going to talk about She Has Me, She Holds Me, She Hands Me the Emptiness by R. Diego Martinez. This is a story that popped out at me because it's a story about depression.
Yeah.
Mental illness, something that I am very familiar with, and something that I think I've read a lot of stories that are sort of depression allegories. But this one, when I read it, I was like, oh yeah, this is what it's really like. And that is why I am so glad that it was submitted to us, frankly, and that we could include it, because I think that is another sort of angle of the Why Didn't You Just Leave? And we have a few other stories that kind of touch on that mental health angle as well. But this one is, I think, the most direct link to depression. Yeah. And in this case, it's depression and or in the form of a ghostly woman who inhabits a house being shared by two men in a bad bad relationship.
Yeah, it's another queer story, and it's definitely, I think there is both real depression and a real ghost.
Yeah.
And that the reason why the ghost is able to create havoc partly is because the main character is depressed. So like the ghost is like, yes, I can work with this.
Yeah, yeah. And you can see how that just kind of like feeds into itself, and it's like it's cycles of trappedness, feeding onto each other.
Yeah, it's a good story. I thought it was really emotionally resonant, and um, as you said, one of a couple of different stories that really dig into mental health issues. So that was good. Next, we have our second story with a trans protagonist, and this one really is about the experience of being trans. It's called Unread Messages by Gabe Converse. And in this one, the protagonist is a trans man whose mother has recently died. And now his mother is haunting him and misgendering him. And it's horrifying. Involves a lot of internalized transphobia and also externalized transphobia. And I see Eric says this is one of his favorites from the anthology. It's so genuinely scary and upsetting and intense. And I agree. Like from the first moment we read that one, we were like, oh, we have to have this one.
Yes. Yes. I'm glad Eric mentioned scary, because in my opinion, this is actually the scariest. Like from the most sort of like filmable, I can see A24 making this into a really, really horrifying horror movie. This is the one with the imagery that will like stay with you and like keep you up at night, in my opinion. So I just think it's extremely scary, and I also find phones very scary.
This will not make you less scared of phones.
Yeah, it's only going to make you more scared of phones, like really scared of phones. Oh, sorry. I just thought of one of the moments in the story, and it just made me shudder. Yep. Okay. All right. Moving on. Okay, so this is a story by one of my favorite writers, Victoria Dalp, because it was Worse Outside. And this is another story that touches on mental health stuff. But it also touches on, this one sort of the angle is agoraphobia more than depression, but it's agoraphobia for very, very reasonable reasons, as you will see in the story. But basically it's about a woman who doesn't really leave her apartment anymore. And then she starts noticing, oh my gosh, it's another limb. It's another limb story.
It is.
There's a limb that starts growing out of the wall in her apartment, and the limb is attached to something else. And she has to negotiate with a very sort of immediate, oh my God, there is something, what the hell is this? But also she has very, very good reasons for not wanting to leave her apartment ever. So yeah, another very creepy, very kind of like kind of icky story. And another note about this one is that I am so glad it was set in an apartment, because that was one of the things that we really wanted, was like, no, not only Victorian houses.
Yeah.
Why didn't you just leave? Could be the smallest abode. It could be a hiker's lodge. And it could be, in this sense, an urban setting, an apartment. So we're really glad that this one is like full on apartment horror.
Yeah. And this is very, I think this is one of two stories that really touch on the sort of question of how bad the immediate environment that you're living in is. And like, not necessarily because of outside things, but because like maybe hoarding or other situations like that. I feel like we have a few stories that kind of touch on that. But this one, because this woman has complex trauma, anxiety, agoraphobia, she's never leaving, but she's also not taking her trash out. So it's like the ghost is a ghost, but also like the personification of the grime that can accumulate when you just can't bring yourself to do any of the things that you might need to make your immediate environment better.
Yeah, very well said.
So next we have another one that actually does touch a little bit on the hoarding situation. Um, not as much as one of the later ones, but this is called Wolves in the Little Pig's House by Shantae Ball. It is this story, like when we read it, I feel like when we had the meeting after we both read this story, I feel like Nadia was afraid that I wasn't going to go for it.
Yeah, I was.
And I was like, this is so messed up. I love it. And Nadia was like, oh, thank God. This is another one with a really messed up family dynamic. It's got three sisters. Their mother has died. Because their mother has died, they have a little bit of money that they didn't expect to have, and they buy a house together. And their house is haunted, but also like their whole dynamic is super messed up, and it is just oh, it's so messed up. It's such a messed up story. I don't want to say any more about it, but
I know.
love it.
Like you don't want to spoil this one, but at the same time, like it's so good, and I was basically just like, oh yeah, we need this, and like Julia said, and Shantae, thank you for being here, and thank you for like letting us, the honor of publishing your story, because it is. This is
story.
the creepiest family dynamic, I think, in the entire book.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, it is one of those where you're like, oh my God, like that's the reaction, more than anybody else. And like, yeah, this is another one that I think is like, honestly, super like filmable and super kind of like viral. Like, honestly, in my opinion, like once you figure out what's actually happening and what the actual meaning of the title is.
Yep. I also think in this one, one of the things that I really liked about it that we didn't see a whole lot throughout this anthology, but I was hoping we would see some of, is that you have characters in this who are like sex workers, and that it's the reality of what that is like, and it's not particularly like sensationalized or anything like that. It's just sort of like sometimes people do sex work, and that's a reality. And I really appreciated that that was just sort of there, low key, being part of the story, but not being a kind of trashy, sensationalized thing like which you sometimes get.
Yeah, and kind of adding on to that point, there's, it's three sisters, and you sort of start off with kind of a first off impression of all of them, but it's another one where your impressions are not accurate and like really critically inaccurate, and like that in and of itself is like a wonderful reminder of like, yeah, women are complicated, and women who might sort of come across in a certain way may actually be your best bet in the end, and vice versa. But it's a great depiction of that too.
Okay, it's you next.
Okay, it's me next. Okay, so we are now going into the third part, as marked by Corey's third entry, which is serial killer floorboards. So that tells you a little bit about what's coming next in this next section. So next is Mother Nature Knows Best by Tanya Ransom. This is another highly unconventional setting. It is a prison. And there's kind of an obvious answer here, right, of like why you didn't leave. But I think that here what's going on in the prison is so much more. There's so many more answers than kind of the obvious answer, A. And B, it is a wonderful, I love epistolary stories that are sort of like evidence-based, like it looks like you're like finding reports. And this one is all letters, medical reports, and I love that kind of thing. It's like found footage horror, and I'm a huge fan of that. So I'm glad that we got such a great example of it in this one. It's also got a very unconventional antagonist, I would say.
Yeah, and I think this is another one where you think you know what's going on, but maybe you don't really know what's going
Yeah,
on.
yeah, yeah. Which I
Um,
think gives you some sense of what Julia and I just like gravitated towards.
yeah. I also thought that this had just like really creepy imagery in the ways that people the ways that the people are dying is I can imagine that being filmed in a very gross and creepy way.
Yeah, and it's also just like the most. I'm glad that we have a story that's like these people literally can't leave.
Yeah.
So like now what? Now what? Now what do you do? Essentially,
Yeah.
it's the most sort of like explicit version of that. So I'm glad that we have that as well.
Yep. Okay, so next, coming back to questionable family dynamics, we have Krista Carmen, which, by the way, congratulations to Krista Carmen for winning the
Woo!
Stoker Award for Best First Novel for The Daughters of Block Island. That was amazing. But Krista Carmen wrote us a story about a mom and her daughter and their bond, which seems to be pretty intense and a haunting that is a haunting by choice.
Yeah, yeah. This one is kind of like it's all it's actually similar to Tanya's story in the sense that there's this sense of haunting as contagion
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
passing hauntings around, which I freaking love. It's one of my favorite themes. Um, yeah, the mother daughter dynamic here is, um, it's interesting because I have also a very close relationship with my recently deceased mother, and it was hard for me to read it as negative at first, as problematic in any way. And I think it was actually like Krista and Julia who were like, "Oh yeah, this isn't good," and I was like, "Oh, but isn't it?" So it's one of those ways that where you might be sort of interrogating your own personal. But I mean, this is a mother who will do anything for her child, and I think questions kind of like the limits of whether there maybe should be limits to that.
That can be good or not.
Yep, 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 yep.
And I know that Krista has a small child, and a part of what drove her to write this was thinking about like how she wishes she could protect her own daughter from anything, getting a cold or anything else.
Yeah.
So yes.
So similar to that,
Mm-hmm.
basically the sequel is Good Company by Susan Colombo. Another mother faced with wanting to keep their child safe and wanting the best for their child. In this situation, however, the mother is an immigrant worker trying to basically get their kid on the same side of the world as them. And in the meantime, what they have to do is serve as this caretaker for this aged, unpleasant woman and the other things in the house that come with the aged, unpleasant woman.
Yep. Yeah, this is I love Susan Palumbo, and Susan Palumbo is a Caribbean Canadian writer, and this is very much the kind of story that says like, you want to come here for a good life, but also what are the trade-offs and how you have to deal with like horrible rich white people. Yes, Eric says Susan is so incredibly brilliant, and I 100% agree. If you have not read any of her other work, go check it out. She's amazing. Alexis says, so excited for Countess, which, yes, Countess is Susan's novella that's coming up, and I'm very excited for that as well. I love this story, The Good Company, because it is about those things, but it is also just a very creepy, in a sort of visceral way, ghost story.
Yeah, it's almost yeah, totally. But one thing that I wanted to mention also, you mentioned like sort of the ghosts of colonialism with kin. I think Good Company is a very sort of here's what colonialism looks like now.
Yep.
Literally ongoing in the world today. So big props for that one as well.
So next we have The Walls in This House by Lindsay Kroll, and oh my gosh, this story. It's another one where again, it's messed up family dynamics. It's a question of like you may think you know what's going on and you probably don't. It's got a creepy, creepy old house. I feel like it's one of the most traditionalist old house, creepy house stories we have. It gave me very Shirley Jackson vibes. And I loved reading it and was just, it's a kind of story where you read it and then you feel like no matter where you are, you're in a cold, gray day.
Yeah. This is like cottagecore gone wild in a bad way, like cottagecore x extreme horror. Because I was going to say that the other thing that this story has is a creepy child. Yes, a creepy child. No anthology is complete without one. This one definitely has that, and the perspective offered by this story is just so unique because it's one of those where like they don't seem as scared as you know they should be, you know, by what's going on, and you're just like, oh my god, like this house is, you know, is, I mean, on one hand it feels like it would be a really cute house, like filled with like, in some ways, okay, I'm a little weird.
I mean, okay, sure, but I feel like it would also be really creepy.
If you love taxidermy, you know, but on the other hand, you're like, this character should be reacting much more, and then you realize what's going
on. Yeah. Which I feel like that's a good segue into the next one.
Yes, that's right. Tell Me Your Sins and I'll Tell You Mine by the wonderful Cassandra Khaw. This is another apartment story. Very, very much an apartment story. It is, in fact, about an entire haunted apartment complex. And this one is great and fantastic because there's multiple sources of horror going. I mean, that's true of a lot of these, but this one, it's like they clash in a very sort of like climactic way. One, there's the haunted apartment complex, but B, there's also something always going on until you reach the end of the story. And then you're just hit with it and you're like, bam.
Yeah, you leave this one and you're definitely like,
it's an incredible turn. So yeah, big fan of this one. And also like props for like sort of like a modern apartment, like hip apartment complex. I felt like I was like, oh, I could imagine this building being like in DC, you know, where like all the new buildings that are sprouting up everywhere. Oh my gosh, Crystal City, Sailor Moon. No, Dark City. Okay, anyway, there's a Sailor Moon apartment complex that's really scary, and it reminds me, I feel like this is like what the story is about.
Yeah, I feel like so in because it was worse outside, you kind of have the kind of the cheap apartment that you can afford when you don't have any money and it's all you can afford. And this is much more the sleek, fancy apartment building that you get because you're like a young urban professional. And I think this one also plays a lot with the question of why you didn't just leave, and has a lot of like questions about specifically the question we ask, which is like why people might choose to stay. And this very clearly has an answer to why people might choose to stay.
Yeah, it's a very personal. It's like, why didn't you specifically just leave?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then we're coming to, speaking of spooky, creepy houses, and we're in our last section of the book. This one is called, the section starts off with Corey's skin house, in which the house is literally made of skin.
So you know things are getting weird in this section.
Kind of see where things are. This, I feel like we start off gently with this one on that theme. This is Alexis Dubon's Where There's Smoke. And this story is also, I feel like, the story that comes the closest to really engaging with the other theme that people always think this anthology might be about, which is domestic violence. Because why didn't you just leave is a question that people ask victims of domestic violence all the time. So a lot of times people hear the title and they think that that's what the book is about, but it is not. We set out to do a ghost story book, not a domestic violence book. And this is the only story that really, truly engages with that theme at all. But in this case, the abuser is the house.
Yep. Yeah, this one is kind of, I'm sorry I'm being so like blithe about this, but like this is like House Hunters. Like imagine like those house reno shows. It's house renovation gone extremely wrong. I love how like the level of detail in this story is beautiful. It really.
Oh no, Nadia, you've frozen.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Can you still
You're
hear me?
back. You're back.
Okay, great.
So
I guess
you loved the detail of this story, and then I didn't hear anything
the
else.
ghostly house wanted to reach out to my computer apparently. The level of detail is like beautiful in this story, and you can really feel the love that the character has for the house, even when the house is hurting her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's definitely goes into that. You see the sort of like the honeymoon phase where everything is nice, and the partner, in this case the house, is being super lovey-dovey and love bombing, and then you see that slowly turning, and you see it get worse and worse. You see her community trying to reach out to her and her rejecting their advances because she knows that the house won't let her, that her partner, her possessive, jealous partner, would make it worse if she agrees to like actually let her community in. And then things just get very, very bad. And it's so beautifully written.
Yeah. Okay, so now we have a very different kind of abode. Anna Jen, which I think is one of our shortest stories. Okay, remind me how to say Rhiannon?
Rhiannon Rasmussen.
Rhiannon Rasmussen. I'm sorry, I'm very bad with pronunciation. So, yeah, I think this is actually our shortest story. But when I read it, I was like, we must have it. Because it is such a unique, quick little snippet of terror. And this is where things start to get really weird house-wise, because it's just like, it's one of those like apartments that you see listed for like, and you're like, wait, is this just a closet?
Is this just a long hallway to a toilet?
Yeah, if you're desperate, like maybe this is all you can get. You know, you're like starting a new school. Maybe this is like fine. Maybe you'll just work your way out of here. But then there's just like questions about what exactly is happening in this sort of like almost, I don't know, like it's time and space warping hallway closet leading to a bathroom.
Leading to just like the toilet with a sink over the top of it.
Yeah.
And if you are creeped out by bathrooms, this one and Spend a Penny will both get you. Also, if you are creeped out by hair and by like finding hair, I feel
like you're creeped out by rent prices.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one.
But I feel like this kind of gave me. You were talking earlier about like J horror and the sort of like vibes of like Ringu, where like her hair is just like streaming in front of her face, and I feel like this has kind of some of that vibe going on, but also like in a very like gross, cheap, is this really an apartment setting?
Yeah, it's very postmodern, which I hope I'm using that word correctly.
Yeah, so then we're not ready to stop being super weird. In fact, we're ready to just completely take you out of everything you think you know and turn it on its head with The Head Harvest by Joe Koch. This story is sort of, it's about someone coming home from their college. And there's a question over whether they should have, whether they were invited, whether anything they're doing is a good idea, and then when they get there, what they find. Alexis says so loopy, and yes.
Yeah, this is like it's like you feel like you're in a nightmare while reading this. Really agreed. You feel like you are, it has that dreamlike sort of writing, and the logic is also dreamlike, and the house is dreamlike. You know, it's like, imagine, like, you know, you're in those nightmares where you open one door and you're like, why am I in this room? Like, what is this room supposed to be again? Like, wasn't I just, it's like that, but a whole story of that. And there's also, I mean, it builds towards a meaning about it's another, terrible family dynamic, but this one is more subtle than some of the others that we've seen. It's much more sort of the kind of repressions that happen in middle class neighborhoods, the kind of family dynamic, and how those twist up vulnerable young minds in various ways. It is a very, very twisty story, and you should absolutely read it because Joe is amazing.
I 100% agree with that.
All right, next. Another one of my pet favorites, Teeth by I.S. Bell, which is about a haunted group house. Yay! I live in a group house, and I was really, really hoping to get one that deals with these sort of themes of like, you know each other, but you don't know each other, and you're all here because it's cheap, but it's not your first choice, and really captures that kind of like the particular sort of desperation and loneliness for a young person in a new place who moves into a new house that they want to make friends with their roommates, but their roommates seem kind of standoffish, and things start to just kind of like feel off, but there's something that wants to be their friend.
Does it want to be their friend, or does it just want to like eat them?
I mean, why not both?
I feel like this story really goes very, very well with the theme of Skin House. It's sort of for this section. And yes, it's very much about the sort of like uneasy relationship that you have with the roommates that you kind of share space with by necessity, but not because you specifically chosen each other.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, I could really see myself as the protagonist here, having lived in a group house for a decade, and just kind of like that sort of desperation for kinship in a place where you should feel at home, but you don't quite have it, and you're trying to remake it with anybody who will have you.
Yeah. Oh, this story. I think Eric said it's so scary for reasons that he can't quite pinpoint. And I kind of agree. And I kind of also feel like there are definite reasons that I can pinpoint, but also it does leave you just extremely unsettled.
Yeah.
But finally, our last story is Am I the Asshole for Setting My Dad's Trailer on Fire by Max Booth III. This story, I feel like this was one of the first stories that we got back from our authors when we solicited authors. And Max wrote this story in just like a white hot frenzy and then sent it to us. And I read it, and it really felt like I was reading a Reddit post. It is all about a young woman who is going home to deal with the aftermath of her mother's death, and her parents were hoarders and they lived in a trailer, and it's a trailer full of just horrible things. And there is a reason why we put it in the Skin House section, but I don't know if we want to get into that.
No, I don't think we should get into that. But I want to also say the illustration is another illustration.
Yes.
And I know that I think Max said that like just looking at it was like, oh, it looks like they just like plucked it out of my head.
Yeah. And Max had said like this was a very drawn from life story that had a lot of personal significance to him. So I think he said, this looks amazing and I never want to look at it ever again about the illustration.
Yeah. I think one of the things I love that we ended here because it's a lot of our authors, I think, pulled from very personal places for their stories.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's what we were hoping for. And that sort of because I think the question of why didn't you just leave is like a very personal question ultimately. Like there's some societal dynamics that we can all kind of pinpoint, you know, and say like, yeah, that's a factor. But really it's a question that, you know, only you and you alone can answer. And I feel like they all did that. And this one is sort of is a really great explicit demonstration of the back and forth around leaving because of the negotiation that the main character has with their father, who in this case is the one who will not go.
Yeah, won't go. Oh, anyway, I guess that's the end of our beautiful book of stories. Why didn't you just leave? It's gorgeous. Our interior formatting is gorgeous and was done by Sam Cowan. It's just a lovely book. We had 4 full-page illustrations. Here's the illustration from Lamai. And it's been a pleasure working on this book. It's been a pleasure working with Nadia and with Eric.
Yeah, I was so happy to publish this one. I think hearing you both talk about what you love about these stories, obviously I read it and I really loved it, but getting to hear your perspectives too is very, very special. Makes me realize like, oh yeah, I mean, like we got a banger of a book here. So. We do have a question from Alexis Dubon, one of our authors, who asks, do you two think you might work together again in the future? So,
oh gosh, well, we haven't.
It's a hard question, maybe on the spot, but
we haven't discussed that since we just barely got through the beautiful process of making this book. But I certainly very much loved working with you, Nadia. I would be happy to do it again if the right project comes along.
Me too. And I think what I think was so interesting about our partnership was like we didn't know each other. Like, we were total strangers until we worked together on this book. But like I come from sort of a strictly horror background. Julia is more well-rounded in speculative fiction, including like fantasy. Like, I mean, I think Julia was like alternating between like this like optimistic world of possibility Kickstarter and this like extremely dark Kickstarter at the same time, which I think made for like a really good editorial balance. Because we had to like meet each other, you know, halfway, and like the stories that we picked like truly represented like stories that we both loved. And I think there was some fear that we were like, oh my god, are we gonna have the same taste?
Yeah,
it was actually way easier, I think.
Oh no, I think once we actually started reading and discussing stories, we both very much ended up gravitating towards the same ones. It's also helpful to understand that, like, yes, I do a lot of different things. I've written horror and I've also written very fluffy things, and I've edited both of those things as well. And the other project that I do have, Worlds of Possibility, which is ongoing, is specifically for happy, hopeful, and uplifting science fiction and fantasy. So a lot of people right now think of me associated with that, and I had to be very strictly like, listen, I am editing this other anthology. It is not happy. We're not. This is not going to make you feel good about life.
I appreciate your range, Julia.
we all have light and darkness in us. I feel like this is humans are complex.
Yeah.
So we have one more question from actually my beautiful boyfriend. So I'll put that on the screen here too. Were there any recurrent themes or images across submissions that surprised you? Something in the water that kept cropping up in people's stories?
That's a great question. I mean, my first answer is one that I think we touched on, like family really was like the recurring theme, and we weren't sure what was going to be the recurring theme, honestly, because it could have been a lot of things. But I think sort of the depth of kinship, and sort of that, and you know, I mean, I'm reading or thinking about this whole sort of family estrangement dynamic that is like more and more of a thing in today, because I think that's more of an option than it used to be. And I wonder if in some cases these are kind of like responses to that kind of change in the water about like what a family is and what it could be. and then what it means if you do leave your family behind. So I don't know. That just occurred to me.
Yeah, I would say that that definitely runs deeply throughout a lot of the stories. There's a question of like, what does biology versus found family mean to all of these characters? And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's very bad. And I think that another thing that I was kind of surprised to see was the number of stories that kind of that we got in the submissions that when it comes down to it, what you're looking at is some sort of like sentient fungus. We have a couple of them that we did take for the anthology, but the number of stories we saw that had this, I feel like a lot of people are very
Yeah.
taken with this at this time.
Yeah, and maybe that's an issue of like the, how much mold is in people's house. So like, yeah, there's definitely a theme of like unhealthy house, sick house, that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. And I think I feel like it's just a cultural thing too. Right now, I feel like now more than any other time in my life, I'm seeing a lot of people championing like drinking mushroom coffee or, eat cordyceps. Those are good for you. And then you learn what cordyceps are and they're terrifying.
We do have, I'm going to give us one final question, only because it is sort of the inverse of that one. This is Alexis asking, was there anything you were surprised not to have seen? Which is also a tricky question.
I think honestly, what I was surprised, not that we didn't see, but that we didn't take any of in the end, were stories that really were centered on a domestic violence situation. Literally, the only story in this anthology that really has that real dynamic. There are messed up family dynamics, and there is abuse that happens, but there's no like partner domestic violence. This woman is trapped by a possessive man story, other than the house being the abuser in Alexis's story. And we did get a few submissions that had it as a theme, but we read and discussed them. And some of them we discussed for a long time and went back and forth on. And we ultimately just didn't feel like any of them quite felt right. Because if you're going to take on that sort of theming, it's really important that you do it with a lot of care and attention.
Yeah.
And not to say that the authors who submitted it weren't doing that. I was thinking
Yeah.
more of like us as editors, like what are we showing in what context?
Yeah, there were certain stories that I was like, I don't think that we as editors are equipped to handle this with the amount of attention that it needs.
Or that like they might not sit right with the other stories that we have. Like if you juxtapose them with these other stories, does it make it seem less important than it is?
Yeah. I'm kind of surprised that we didn't get as many like school stories, like boarding school, college, that kind of thing.
Yeah, of course, if you want some haunted, creepy school stuff, you can check out Bitter Apples.
What a great transition.
All right. Well, hey, thank you both. One last comment. It's not a question, but from, again, my beautiful boyfriend, who I'm going to introduce that way every time, says maybe everyone who submitted is being controlled by the same sentient fungus colony. And I think that's a great theory. I'm convinced of it at this point, too. So you never know.
Oh, man. I mean, that explains why they all gel together so well.
Yeah, yeah. I want to thank you both for coming and talking about the stories tonight. This is super fun. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. I've only used StreamYard once, which is how we are streaming this right now. So I hope the video will be preserved on YouTube. I think it will. I will double check, but when I tested it earlier, it seemed to be the case. So for anyone who has not tuned in already, yeah, you will have your chance. I don't know why I'm talking to people who aren't here, but anyway, thank you both.
For everyone who tuned in.
Yeah. And if you've not read it yet, why didn't you just leave? It is available now. 22 great stories. Get your ghosts.
Get your ghost on.
Thanks, all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.